Hi everyone, in these notes we'll study the idea of reactivity in a little bit more depth. So remember, the idea of reactivity is that in a Shiny app, the code isn't running from just the top to the bottom. Code is running anytime some sort of input is changed. So how should you reason about code that's not just linearly executed like that? Probably the most useful conceptual device for reasoning about this kind of reactive code is to think about it as a graph. It's a graph where you have nodes for inputs, you have nodes for outputs, you have nodes for intermediate computation, and edges represent dependencies. So how do certain outputs depend on certain inputs that the user makes? How do certain intermediate computations depend on those inputs as well? So that sounds kind of abstract. How does it look like in some of the apps that we've looked at? So, this is the very simple, just type in your name, say hello, your name kind of app. It's just one input, one output. I've drawn the nodes to make it clear what is an input and what is an output. And all that's being done, one edge, anytime this input changes, it executes everything downstream. In this case, there's only one node that's downstream. Okay, that was a simple one. What about the one about showing the histogram and the samples? So it looked like this. There were three inputs. There was a mean, standard deviation, and then sample size. From those three inputs, you would run this kind of reactive expression. So we can look at the code. There was this reactive expression in the middle in the server. And both of the outputs, both the plot and the table, depended on that reactive expression. Because this samples is being used in both of the expressions. So you can see, even just from the code, that it has this graph structure. There are these three inputs that go to the reactive expression, and that shared reactive is in both of these outputs. Okay, that's how you get this graph structure. This also gives another perspective on reactive expressions, right? It's saying that our initial implementation is a very densely connected graph, right? It's this picture. Okay. When we weren't sharing the computation, both the histogram and the data table would refer to the inputs. So it ends up being very dense. When you introduce these reactive intermediate computations, it's able to share all the input into one internal node. This just makes a much simpler computation graph. Okay, let's see this idea for a little bit more complicated app. So it's an app for power analysis. Before looking at the code, let's look at how it actually runs. So this is what the user sees. There's going to be some output from a test. There's going to be a histogram showing samples, and you're allowed to change the means and the standard deviation and sample size within each group. So here, if I have very small sample size, right? You can't really tell that there's a difference between these two groups. But as soon as you have many samples, then it becomes very clear. Very simple app. What are the inputs and outputs? What is the reactive structure? Okay, there are 4 inputs. They're all different slider inputs. Those 4 inputs go into this one reactive expression. So you imagine there are 4 edges flowing into one node. This one node is going to rerun anytime any of those 4 inputs are changed. And then this one kind of middle reactive node is flowing into 2 outputs. One that creates a plot showing these 2 histograms, and another one that's creating a table that shows the output from the test. The output from the test right here. The structure is actually identical to the previous app that we showed. It's just what I do to create the plot and what I do to create the table is a little bit different, right? The ggplot code has to fill it in by the group. And to create the table, I'm not just printing the numbers in the data frame, I'm running a t-test, converting it to a data frame, and getting the values that I want to display. But structurally, it's the same, and the reactive graph is the same. Just one extra input node. Okay, that's probably the main idea about reactivity. There's one kind of tangential idea I just want to introduce because you might see it in some other code that's out there. It might be useful in some of the applications that you're interested in. There's a kind of expression called an observe expression. So an observe node is like a node where you have many kinds of inputs or reactive expressions that flow into it, but it itself doesn't flow out to anything. It's kind of like a node that leaves, it's the end, but it's not technically really an output node because it never appears in the interface. So just a simple example of that is I modified the previous code to include an observe event. What it's going to do is anytime either of these two particular inputs are changed, it's going to print to the R console saying, this is what the mean is for group 1, this is what the mean is for group 2. I can't show you it right now because I'm not running it in the R console. But if you just copy and paste this code into an R file and run it, anytime you toggle the means, it's going to print a message in the console. So there's certain situations where this kind of monitoring is going to be useful.